keeping with tonight's topic, I wanted to share this interesting photo, since we're talking about cemeteries. In the Protestant part of this cemetery, W.G. Van Dorum, colonel of the Dutch cavalry and militia commissioner, is buried. His wife, Lady Van Afferden, is buried in the Catholic. They were married in 1842. The lady was 22 and the colonel was 33. He was Protestant and he didn't belong to any nobility. This caused quite a commotion in their small town. After being married for 38 years, the colonel died in 1880 and was buried on the Protestant part of the cemetery against a wall. When his wife died in 1888, she decided not to be buried in the family tomb, but on the other side of the wall, as close as she could get to her husband. There's two clasped hands that connect the grave across the wall. This is in a cemetery in Rotterdam, Netherlands. I just thought it was very interesting. Just like tonight's speaker, John Skakel, a former farmer from Howard Township, on the farm where his father was born and raised and died. John was actually born in the same room as his father, and he lived there and farmed there until just a few years ago. John is an adventure man. He loves canoeing and adventure, but upon retirement, he needed something else to do. He had already began the business of Fair Time Toys with his partner, Jim Gilbert, selling reproductions of old wooden toys. John was one of the first people to begin work on the Chatham-Kent Cemetery project, and it was he who found almost all of the burial monuments in Ward B of the Maple Leaf Cemetery. Chatham-Kent Cemetery's restoration preservation project has involved both repair of thousands of monuments and later documentation. John is the owner of the website which documents this project. Began on July 4th, 2010, the website has over 26,500 photographs of the cemeteries and a great deal of information documenting the history of many of that had been lost. He, along with Les Mansell, have been instrumental in finding many of the old lost cemeteries in the county that had been plowed down long ago. Today, the website is used a great deal by the archives of Chatham-Kent and by those interested in genealogy and in history. John feels he often gets too much credit for these projects, as others have spent thousands of hours on restoration, preservation, photographing, and endless typing. It takes a large group to do this important work, so let's let John tell us all about it. Please welcome John.
It's interesting you should bring this up, because did you know there was an example exactly like this in Kent County?
The clasped hands one?
No, the husband and wife buried in two separate locations.
Okay, yeah.
In Thamesville,
Oh.
in Sherman Cemetery. The name Terry rings a bell. It's been a long time since I saw this, so I can't even remember whether that's the first or the last name. But the husband is buried in the very back end of Sherman Cemetery, and his wife is buried kind of in the back of the Catholic area. And so that's interesting that that was brought out, and they are husband and wife, and they lived all through their life together. I don't remember how long. It's a similar length of time, like it was many, many years. And they got along well together in life, but when they died, they had to be buried separately because they couldn't, of course, be buried together. Because he couldn't be in the Catholic cemetery, but she had to be. I forget the time frame on that. That's an interesting cemetery, its history, because it was literally forgotten at one point, and then it was brought back. I'm not going to go by a sort of a given text here tonight, but I'm going to be just referring to a few things now and then, just so that I can keep myself straight. I'm going to start with one thing here that's going to be dangerous. And by that, I mean that if you don't take my advice here and remember that what I am going to show you can be a part of research, but it can never be a part of the whole thing, you are going to go home with a totally wrong impression, okay? When I show you what I'm going to show you, I have to show you, and you need to realize that it's something that we can do and we can use to find monuments, we can use to find old cemeteries, we can use for a lot of things, but you never use it without other documentations, because it is never 100% accurate, okay? So I don't want anybody getting up and walking out here in the first 5 minutes and saying, gee, all he could talk about was the stupid part of research that shouldn't have anything to do with it, whatever. But it does. Anybody recognize these? A few people here. Anybody, or does, I take it that, I'm just going to take it that all of you have heard of looking for water with a crotch or a piece of wire. And that's exactly what you can do with these wires. I could go and I could look for wire, but you can look for other things. And I am going to tell you, I'm going to live dangerously here. I'd like you to put up your hands, and I realize this is unusual to ask you folks to do this here, but I'm going to do it anyway. If you know about this, how many people think this is totally bunk? And I would love to know if you do, and don't hold back, please, because I know many people do. I used to. Anybody here thinks it's totally bunk?
I used to when you convinced me it wasn't.
Okay. It's interesting. Okay, we've got at least some people. Now, of the rest of you, how many think that there might be something to do it? You're pretty doubtful that there might be. Okay? What I'm going to do is show you some things, and I am not trying to convince you if this works or not. I am going to begin with the story, however. That story involves putting in a long tile up through my place that was over a half-mile long. About 5 people worked for 2 days, 5 men, to find the old tile, because of course you have to walk in and find those old tile, break them all up. They cause all kinds of problems, sometimes hook in. Doug will tell you all about that. It can be a nightmare. So we had to find this tile. Finding a 50, 75, 100-year-old tile a half-mile long, it's not easy. We couldn't find it all. So one fellow said, I'm going to bring my son back tomorrow morning and see if he can look for this with a wire down for this. We had it all marked. The next day his son come in, and in 2 hours he found what he thought was the whole drain. Okay? Now then, we had sort of 2 sets of wires in places. In every case, when they went to find those wires, that drain, the dowsing wire was correct and the prodding was wrong in every single case. So I began to wonder about this, because up till this point, I thought it was bunk. Now, this was only 15 years ago. I had no idea I could douse back then. I don't know why I can now. It's because I'm some crazy guy. I don't know. Anyways, but that was my beginnings with it. And then one day we were in a cemetery, some of us, and we just started, or one of the fellows had one of these, was doing some work with ground penetrating radar with us in Old Salem Cemetery. And he had one of these. I just grabbed it and thought, man, I can do this, you know. So I'm going to do some experimenting tonight. And again, I'm just showing you this to show you how we can use it. But again, you have to remember whether it's good or bad. I was going to take a look tonight before I came and see whether I can pick up anything here. Let's see whether we can pick up anything. Okay, there's something underneath right here, okay? Cindy, I would like you to come over back here for a minute. And I'm picking up 3 things, just back over here. You take this, and you got a 2-fold job, okay? My hand is like this, and what I want you to do is drop that into my hand. I'm just gonna have you drop it in. You can try it if you want later. But what I want you to do then is to walk along with me and make sure that my hands do not move in any way, to make it move, okay? So you're the proof that I'm not moving, okay? And we're just gonna go along, and there I found something. Did my hand move? Okay. And now the wire is going back, and just keep a look. Did my hand move? Okay. Now grab this, and I want you to pull that out and make sure there's no friction. There's no friction in any way, right? Okay. So for now, that's what I wanted to do, was to have you prove that. So that goes at least that far to saying that I'm not cheating in any way here. Now then, what I'm going to show you is going to go even further. Okay, there's a question.
For what it's worth, I've dowsed for grains many times over the years. I've always found that it works very well. How it works, I've got no idea. I know
Yep.
that it does.
I'm going to kind of get into a possibility of that in a minute, but now, what's really going to look strange to you people I'm going to be here. This wire is exactly the same way. It's just sitting in here. Okay? I can start and I could ask the wire a question. Okay? And it will answer by turning. And I could say, wire, give me a yes. Wire, give me a no. The reason I'm showing you this, and I can actually say wire reverse. Now wire, give me a yes. So yes is now here. I could say again, wire reverse. Wire, give me a yes. The reason I'm showing you this is, we're going to take it one step further now. And we're going to go and find this, and I'm over top of something. Now, I'm going to say something that I'm sure this isn't in order to demonstrate. Wire, is this a human grave? And it's no, okay? Wire, is this an electrical wire? Yes, okay. Now, the crux of this, what I'm really trying to show you is, wire, is this over 2 feet deep? Yes. Is this over 3 feet deep? No. Okay. So what I'm doing, the reason I'm doing you this, now I can begin to tell you. We can go to a cemetery and we can begin to look for things. And we can find the outlay of a cemetery, and we can, for instance, if this is an old plowed down cemetery, the size of this room, I could say, wire, show me the corners, and the wire will roughly show me the corners, and I can prove it. But how do you know it's a cemetery? First off, well, let's try it here. Wire, is there anything buried near here? Interesting. Wire, might this be a human burial? No. Wire, this was an animal burial. Could you point to me where it is? And obviously somewhere down there. I'm not going to go down and find it. But you can see what happens. Now, if this was an area and we found something, if we found one burial, what's it mean? It means nothing, probably, okay? It means very little. there's one more thing I could do, which would maybe say there's a very small chance that it might be. This is why I showed you about the depth. I could say wire, how deep is this? And if it was approximately 4 feet deep, it might be a burial, but that's pretty far-fetched, because it could be a tank, it could be anything, okay? Now, go to that same area way back out in the farmer's field someplace where it's been plowed, and find 2 pits like that close together that are laid out exactly parallel. Is that is that 2 graves or not? You're getting a little better chance that it might be. I would never begin to say that it was. The chances are still pretty small, but chances are getting a little bit better if you've got 2 shafts about the same size. Sometimes you can get 1 shaft half the length, half the width. That's even maybe a little more proof, because it's kind of interesting. You got 2 different things. Why would one be half the size of the other? Child, exactly. And oftentimes you see that, more often than not. So that's a pretty good indication. But you really got to be careful if it's only 2. Got to be extremely careful if it's 1. It's probably not at all. Get to a field and find something the size of this room, and imagine that it's all laid out with shafts, 6 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, end to end this way, with walkways about this large between them. Man, it's pretty convincing, especially if you go over top of all of those. They're about 4 feet deep, and if you've got children in there, and what's more telling, oftentimes there's a singles area, or it could be an old potter's field area, but you'll find them solid where there's no breaks, but most of that cemetery has breaks where there were plots with people not buried in it and so on. So what I'm saying is you need to really watch what you're at. Now, I'm going to move off of this a little bit, and I can say, okay, I started this by saying I've got to show you something to show you the negatives of it. And the negatives are, you need to realize what you are looking at. If we go out, on Doug's old place, there was an old cemetery. Okay, we know that because there were monuments found. Now, I don't know whether Doug knew where it was or not. I'm not even going to get into that because it doesn't get into this. But say he didn't know where it was, and we went out and found on a hill near where those monuments were what we could almost prove by dowsing was a cemetery. If on top of that, especially, we found out some reference in KOGS room that said there was a cemetery on that lot, man, it is never 100% proof, never, but I'll tell you, you're getting extremely high, like probably 95% chance or better. On the other hand, if we're walking out, for instance, we found behind Sherman Cemetery in Timsville, we believe that we have probably found old Timsville Cemetery. It's a long ways back. It's like the length of a farm back. We're able to trace the old road back and so on, and we knew there were burials there. Now, this is still pretty subject to a little bit of question because there's not much documentation on it. But that shows the other type of cemetery, and so you have to realize how far you go with this. So now, we mentioned, to begin to round this up, we mentioned talking about dowsing at the start and how we would use it, and that's one of the reasons one of the ways we've been able to use it. And there are many cemeteries, the old cemeteries that we have found, And not far again from Doug's place, right underneath Old 21 Highway. If any of you know where Hank Dobson lived, just that way up from Kent Bridge on Highway 2, the river comes in like this, curves back out. Right in the middle of it, one day I went in and I thought, gee, I wonder whether I can find any graves, because this is along the river. I was just having fun. Man, suddenly it showed it was on top of the cemetery. I began to lay this thing out, and it's big. I mean, by big, I mean, it makes this room look small, okay? It was right under the road to the other side. But we still didn't have proof. Looked, called, found nothing. And Les was said a number of times, and other people began to realize, and suddenly we realized there was a Howard Bridge Cemetery thought to be on the other side of the road. The river, sorry. But we have began to realize probably it was on the opposite side of the river. And I have probably found Howard Bridge Cemetery again by mistake. I emphasize the word probably. Sorry, okay. I emphasize the word probably. But Howard Bridge Cemetery was totally lost. There's a very good chance it has been found again. There are other cemeteries that were totally lost that were quite well documented as being in this or that position on a certain farm or whatever, and they were found there. Where else do we use it? Imagine that we are doing some work finding monuments in, say, Old Maple Leaf. And we go along and say your books say that there were 4 monuments right about here. We can only find one of those. If we go in and walk across those burials, we can find out where all of those burials are. So if we can't find those monuments, those lost ground level headstones, footstones, whatever you want to call them, we can actually go and I can flag out all of the burials there. And then when you know where the burials are, and if you, in particular, if you know where one stone is, you can probably guess the others were put in similarly. You can almost walk on top of the stone and find it while it's night. That's another place where we can find it. So that just gives you an idea of the uses of this and what you can do with it. Again, I stress that it has to be used along with research. It is never 100% accurate, but it is an extremely good indication. This is just a piece of copper wire. Most times you will see people use 2 copper wires, okay? I find I use only 1 because it takes much more concentration to use 2. So I can do it more accurately with 1 wire than 2. I call it with 2 wires, my term for it is after dinner. I went canoeing with Joni and Gary McGuffin, and Gary talks about after dinner paddling when you're going solo. Some of you may have saw somebody with a canoe almost turned over and so showy, and that's after dinner paddling. This is after dinner dowsing where you use the 2. But I find that it's much easier, much more accurate to use 1. Copper wire is best. You can use it with a lot of things. You can use it with a coat hanger. I'm going to try something just to show you. And most of this is fiberglass. So this is not very accurate, but I don't know whether I can get it to balance or not. See that? It was actually turning. I could do the same thing. And we actually oftentimes use the prod to do it. The prod is not as accurate as the wire, but close. And so you can use it. You can use a lot of different things. You can use a big crowbar, not a wrecking bar, but the big long crowbars if you wish. You can use a lot of different things. And then, of course, it's the same thing as using a willow branch. I've never tried it with that because you can make a little wire and do it, whereas you gotta have a lot more knowledge to do it with a willow branch and so on. But a lot of different things. The most common one is a coat hanger, but the copper wire is best to use. Has to be straight. If I was to take this end and bend it back over on itself, it would not work. Okay? Another question?
That was the same question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Another question here? Somebody here?
Yes, is it a magnetic pole? What's
Oh,
magnetic?
yeah. What I forgot to tell you. Good question. Glad you reminded me. And I'm gonna go back to another story here to answer this. And I hope I don't, if I get off topic, and sometimes that happens, and I'll forget what I'm talking about and forget to answer the damn question. If I do, let me know. The best theory on what is going on is you have often heard how we have got many things stored in the back of our mind that we can't get out. Okay? It's one of the theories as to why ghosts work, is that people do actually see this stuff. I've saw it enough. My sister thinks I'm crazy over here, and I'll say, but I've saw these things enough, and people talking to them enough that you begin to become convinced that they are seeing something, but what are they seeing? And one of the theories is exactly the same as this, that they have just read about things, they know about things and so on. There's information stored in their back of their mind, and this allows them to bring it out. The story is, I may have found the burials, and I stress may, for the soldiers from the War of 1812 at the old battle site, okay? Soldiers from each side plus the natives. They were unknown, they still are. Before major changes with the cemetery people this summer, they were going to actually do some work peeling the tops off of them as a first step to do some research. But we believe we could have found them. Now, basically, I went out and I had done a little bit of research, and I had found an old document on this talking about, and it talked about the burial of these soldiers and what all they went through and the feelings of the soldiers and how I believe they dug the trenches that night and they laid there all night and were guarded by dogs during the night and so on. And then basically they were buried the next day. One of the things you can do with this, you can kind of go and interpret what seems to be these people's thoughts, and it really, what it is this stuff coming out of your mind, okay? So you gotta remember that. But I went, and I wasn't getting the feeling that this was right, this part about the dogs. So suddenly I started, and I went back one night, it was on the computer, this is all on my website, and I went back on the computer and I reread it, and there weren't any dogs. And it was the wire telling me, darn it, Skakel, go back and read it again, because there were no dogs there. And all that was happening, it's so simple, because I had remembered it wrong, but the back of my mind was telling me, okay, there weren't any dogs there, go back and read this darn stuff on your own. And that is basically what's happened. When you're looking for water, the theory is that we as humans used to know how to find water. We as humans used to know how to find disturbed soil, because it could be used in regards to finding water, in regards to planting things, all kinds of things. We've forgotten it, but we can't get that out of our brain. And that it's just that simple. We as humans might know about a Roman soldier, so maybe we can go to a certain place and see the ghost of a Roman soldier. And this is what some people think is exactly going on with ghosts. Most people can't do it. But maybe 1% of the people, it's just coming out of their brains. So I don't want to keep going on this, but any more questions first?
I think what you're saying is the person. If you keep saying you can do this and you can do that, but it's really you. You could say, I can do this.
Yep.
But like someone else took that rod and walked in the same place you were walking, it wouldn't necessarily happen. It's you.
With time, about 90% of the people in here can do it. I've heard it said that 99%, I think that's a little high. But you have to, there's a certain amount in belief in it, and there's a certain amount in going along, knowing how to hold it, because you have the least bit of, just even the least little bit of friction on that wire, it isn't gonna work. There's a lot of things that get into it, so. But yeah, it's harder for certain people than others. I don't know why I can do it better than most. Some people can't. Like, I just picked it up and I could do it, and I could instantly find old buildings. Like, I can go to an old cemetery. My sister and I were out the other day, went to an old cemetery. And I said, I think the way this is all laid out, there's a church here. It was one of the ones just down in Essex, St. George's. And I said, I think there's an old church here. And I found where one of the old, I don't know what they call them, they're reverend anyway, was buried. I thought this would be about where the church was. I looked, found the approximate position, got the wire out. Oh, it was about 40 seconds finding the old church. And looked around, she says, are you sure? And I said, yeah. And I said, I'm gonna do another thing. And I went to what should be the front, and I could actually find the entryway sticking out in the front. So there's, again, it's not 100% sure, but man, it's pretty convincing if a building like that, in a position like that with the entryway out front and so on. So, any other questions before I go on? Okay. The main thing with that is, again, to remember, as I said, that you do need the history behind. Peggy did a presentation here, and I know they did a good job on all of the work that we have done on restoration of the cemeteries and so on. I'm not going to get into that big time. I'm going to show you a couple of things, because I don't know whether they did, or one thing, I don't know whether they did or not. You probably know what this is. In case you don't, this is a fraud. If we find where we think that there should be a grave, this is what, or a monument, this is what we use to find it. The big key to it right here is in the bulge in the end, and you can shove this down, that shoves the soil away to keep the friction down. So you can find graves very quickly. As long as it's fairly modern, so the grave is done with the cement wall, you can find them quickly. I could show you a couple of them in maple leaf that are, less than about 4 inches deep. So they're not always what they seem to be. The suggestion is that old ones might often be shallower because they would be scared of digging. I've come to the belief and the understanding it's probably opposite, because today they're in vaults, so they don't need to worry about coyotes, pigs, all kinds of things getting in and tearing the remains apart, whereas in the old times they did. So today they get lazy, and I could show you in one place at least where it was so shallow back in maple leaf that it's actually heaped up on top in order to get cover over it. That's how shallow it is. So you can imagine that, what you can get into, but we've never found an old one that way. I'm going to open up to questions later, but basically I'm not going to say anything on that because they covered it, but we'll have questions later on if you'd like to get into that. What I will say, 2 things. Remember, number 1, there's a lot of cemeteries, so if you start throwing names at me, there's like 160 names. I'm probably going to be as lost as you are, but we'll see. The funny part of it is for somebody like me talking out here, because I said to Cindy one night, I can talk to you people and you totally lose me because you start talking about all these names and I always say, you know, I'm one of these guys, I have a hard time remembering my dad's last name. Like, that's how bad I am at genealogy. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an idea on the website today before we kind of start to wrap things up here. I'll try and not get too long into it. But why do we have a website? Why did we start? What were our feelings and so on? What started with the Restoration Preservation Project? The reason that I call it with those two names, everybody knows what restoration of a cemetery is. Technically, it should be preservation of a cemetery because you can't restore it back to regular. But if I went downtown to someplace and said I was working preserving a cemetery, they're all gonna, what the heck's he talking about? So that's why I use both names. But basically, we started that one night. I went to a meeting and Lisa Gilbert talked about it. I went to a meeting and Tom Klassen, one of the fellows who often does repairs around here on cemeteries, came out and showed us how to do it and so on. And we began to do work on Old Maple Leaf. I actually started out on Ward B to find all of the old monuments there. And we got further and further along, and I began to say to Bruce, Warwick, and the others, I don't know as Trish and Peggy were, before I go on, there's Peggy and Trish and Paul and Les who have all been highly involved with this here. I don't think there's anybody else here, but those people all have been, all of them have done huge amounts of work. So, stand up, everybody that has been. Because I could have missed people. Yeah, because they should know you, yeah, and Paul back there and Les again. All of these people have done huge amounts of work, and we are not talking hundreds of hours of work. We're talking thousands or almost tens of thousands, okay? We got started to talk one day, we were taking all of these pictures. Well, what do you do with all these pictures? So I said, well, we should open up a private website to store pictures. Well, then gradually it got into, why do we have a private website? Why not make it public? So if it's gonna be public, it should be good pictures, okay? So if it's gonna be good pictures, they should be labeled. So if they're gonna be labeled, it should be all labeled properly and all divided out by, according to what cemetery they're in and so on. Yeah, and this is part of the website you're seeing here, and these are some of the ones that she is showing here are all the ones we have already documented. And you will see that it's a lot of them. We're well along the way. Huge thanks to Doug Gammon from Windsor as well on photography. But anyway, we gradually began to lay this out, and suddenly I realized that this website was a good idea, but how do you do it? And I got looking at the websites on the internet, and no offense to anybody from anywhere that's worked on any of these, but I suddenly began to realize they're all done wrong. And how to, you know, man, they could so easily be improved, and I could see where they'd gone wrong. For one thing, and it's ironic to say it here with this group, but they were all dead, okay? They were all photographs of monuments of dead people and nothing else. Okay, so how do you spruce this up? You add the history. When you add the history, you begin to add the lives of the people. So the website has two different angles to it, all the way through. One is history, one is photographs as you get into it, or basically genealogy. Okay, what basically happened is we started to define this and get it working better. I went basically, first I made a little comical website, which I've never showed to many people because most of you would have laughed like crazy. Probably a couple of you would have gotten offended by it. but it was just a research tool to allow us to look at how to do this. And finally, we got to where I could begin to put it together, and I went totally silent. I abandoned it as far as anybody knew for 2.5 months. But they didn't know I was still working at it, but I knew I had to do this alone. Suddenly I come back and said, guys, we've got a brand new website, enough space to store something like 150,000 pictures, as I recall. It's unfortunately me as paper. But it's hosted in the US because we couldn't host it around here because you couldn't afford to do it. But anyways, one of the first things we got into, and Les and I talked extensively about this, was you people have all the books documenting this information and you make money out of that. So how do we not cut you out? And this is one of our biggest challenges with the website, is how do we not actually run competition with you? And the way we did that, if you get looking in here, you will notice that in very few cases do we use all of the text from the monument. So we go back and say, if you want to begin to put things together, see all the text from all of these monuments and so on, go to KOGS, and we are not undercover at all. We constantly send people back to you that way. And so what we hope is we realize that we do actually help people to not use your books and not buy them. But we hope that we actually send more people back in return to actually increase you a little bit. So that's why that was done that way. As we went along, we gradually just began to develop the website more and more. And it took some time, and so the website now does not look a great deal like it did when we began. But it is amazing, the comments that I might just show you some later on here, I'll see how things go. But some of the positive comments that we have got from people on the website itself, particularly because of the historical end of it, but the fact that it's going along so well. There is one rumor I want to dispel. We have not abandoned Maple Leaf. I've heard that about 3 times lately, that we've abandoned Maple Leaf, work on Maple Leaf and St. Anthony's, and we have not. And in fact, we're beginning work on Ward F with a new gal, I believe, right away, and starting to put it on. Basically, all of the other cemetery, if you discount Maple Leaf, St. Anthony's, which will never be totally done, we're just hoping to complete the old regions, similar to what you people did before, really, except they'll be updated a little bit because of the new, the new work that's come along since. But if you disallow those or throw those out, because then there is a lot of work being done on those. And then there is the Wallaceburg Cemetery, which Henry Van Haren is working on, which is big. That's going to take some time. And then we will do Blenheim and Dresden separately. Take all the rest of the other cemeteries. Right now, Crawford or Crayford, depending how you, the one out here, pronounce it, is almost done. Then there is the 2 Marpus cemeteries, there is Highgate, there is Moraviantown Cemetery, the big one, and there is Mayhew, Mount Pleasant, St. Paul's, which is already about 1/3 to 1/2 photographed, and Blackburn, and that is it. All the rest of the cemeteries have been photographed, they're documented. Once they are photographed, Trish has done a lot of work with all of that, and putting different cemeteries, more so on Maple Leaf and St. Anthony's and so on. Photographs are stored, if you get in there, into an area called the gallery, which is basically a storage area. They are roughly labeled in there, or I should say well labeled, but it's harder to find a particular one in there. Then you'll see an area called Find a Stone, which you go into that area and you can look at Doug's relative Smith, for instance, and you can see all of the Smith monuments. And if you go down and you want to find Robert Smith in the cemetery, and you suddenly find his name on Find a Stone, that means there's a Robert Smith in that cemetery. We have, 3-4 gals that'll be working this winter on doing a lot of typing on that sort of thing. At least four that I can think of, I think I'm right on 4. Some of these things take a lot of work, I'll tell you, the actual setup on parts of this. I am constantly changing things. For instance, we just have gotten permission to use a map from Chatham-Kent on as many cemeteries as they've gotten. I hope that they will be doing some upgrading to put all the rest on the map. It's a little ticklish. It's always so hard to get them moving, but we're hoping they will. It's got about half to 2/3 of the cemeteries on it now. And if you looked at that about 3 days back and looked at it now, you wouldn't recognize it because I was just in there and totally rebuilt the whole area because it had expanded so much it no longer made sense. So we had to separate it all out. Basically, the website, all of the website is in 2 parts in 2 different ways. One, there's the history area, one genealogy area. It's also divided up with, what was I gonna say now? I forget. Anyway, I'll think about it. But that basically gives you an idea on how things work in there. So, trying to think, I think that's most things covered here now, so. One of the interesting things we just found, I'm not going to bring out a lot of things, a new name for Potter's Field that we found in documentation was called the Stranger's Burial Ground. That's the old Potter's Field over here. And so it's interesting that there is also a Stranger's Burial Ground in Dresden. So that makes us begin to wonder, was Stranger's Burial Ground the name that was actually used more often? If it was used here twice, was it used in a lot of others? Was it used in a lot of other areas and so on? And of course, a lot of these old cemeteries were supposedly moved, but we have found many of them, we know where they are, and there are many examples. I'm of course a bit of a rebel, and one night I was in Ottawa doing some research for the toy business. At midnight I went down to the Parliament buildings and I see this cop coming out, rushing out, and then, oh God, now I'm in trouble, you know. How are you doing, you know, isn't it cold out here tonight? Yeah, so anyway, then I landed up over at the chateau and the night watchman comes along and starts talk to me for an hour. It was like 2:30 in the morning when I got back to the hotel. Anyways, this guy comes along and starts talking about these old cemeteries in Ottawa. He says, we keep digging up these old cemeteries and they keep finding bones. And I say, yeah, that's exactly what happens. And we know that there are many of them in Chatham. We know that between the library and Old St. Paul's is one old one. Right behind the store at, what is that store way out here? With the cemetery behind it, the grocery store right on Indian Creek Road.
No frills.
No frills, right, yeah. And right behind that, right, they had to know the cemetery because if you drive behind there, you'll see a parking lot. The edge of that parking lot is the beginning of the old cemetery. Was it moved? Yeah. Was it moved? No. You know what I mean. They would move the bones or the bodies that were new. They would move some of the bodies that they could find, but there's all kinds of them, you know, that were still in there. So, anyway, those are just a couple of things. Anyway, that's basically, that's pretty much, I think, what I was going to cover with one exception, and then we'll have some questions. We can always use help. There are a lot of ways we can use help. We can use physical help on the site. The site work has kind of died down a lot this year because I unfortunately got in kind of bad shape last year myself, and I've been trying to recover here for almost a year. But I'm gradually getting back. I had cancer of the pancreas, and it's taken a little bit of time, but I'm getting close. But when we get back, we can use more work on site to help to do digging and so on. And there's all kinds of work we can do, and we'll never complete it all. You do need a little bit of training to be able to do it, and permission to be in there and so on. But there is also kinds of work on the website to do, all kinds of typing. There are endless areas of material that hasn't been checked, and that is huge. So one thing that I got to say is that I have, and I'm glad I remembered this, I have huge, huge, huge respect for you people with the work that you did before. Doing it with the modern computer, man, I get so many errors creeping in and so on, and it is so hard to keep this right, and that's with a computer. When I think of what you folks in your group accomplished back in and around the 1980s, it's unbelievable. So that's one thing that I want to say is, and that really has been a huge help to us. There's another group that I have to thank, and that is the Council of Chatham-Kent. So often we go on and we find these similar projects to this one. This one we truly believe is the biggest. We've been told it is by far the biggest project of its type in North America volunteer. I believe it probably is, but I don't know for sure. I would never complain that or never say that just because it's hard to know for sure. Is it or isn't it? I don't know. But, you know, it certainly could be. But we go to these other projects and you start to see them using dirt. And you wonder why, but it's because they haven't got money to use gravel. And yet using dirt, it's basically useless to do this restoration work without gravel, because it just goes back the way it was so fast. You have to use gravel. And I'll tell you, you bring in a load of gravel and it can be gone if you're doing a lot of work in like 2-3 days. It's unbelievable the amount of the cost. Add to that, you get to these big, huge suckers of monuments, and Chatham-Kent has been giving like $10,000 a year toward this project to have Tom Clausen come in and do work on some of these. And suddenly Chatham-Kent Cemetery, which I'll tell you was literally almost a death trap, is now back to pretty much being safe again. Bothwell was just done this year and is now safe again and so on. I can't thank them enough for giving them credit, and it's not because there's an election coming or anything, it's because they deserve it.
Who owns that property behind No Frills? Is that privately owned or does the city,
I can't tell you on the ownership, but what I can, Cindy, come on up because I'm very deaf, so I might need you to translate here. So just in case you can listen. I did hear Donna, but in case I miss it, you might need to translate. Yeah, I've never heard the ownership, who owns that. I have a feeling that it's owned by Chatham-Kent. But it is very, very obvious. I can go back with the dowsing wire and I can find basically nothing in there. And then you go back behind there and basically you see the edge of the pavement like this, and you see grass, and within like 6 inches you're into the cemetery. Okay? Another place that's like this is the donut shop in Blenheim, which is another cemetery. And it is exactly the same way. It goes right up to the edge of their building. In both of those cases, I think in the case of the donut shop, somebody knew where it was, where they could build and so on. And in the case of the old cemetery, I think they knew. Another case that comes to mind, I am virtually certain that we have found the old Ebert Cemetery, which is basically right at the road in the old waterworks in Chatham-Kent, across from where Heritage Days used to be by the railroad track there. everybody at first said, gee, it couldn't be in there because there were tanks in there. But then we began to realize, no, this cemetery goes right up to where those tanks were and bang, it's gone, it's done, okay? Put yourself back, that's an old, those old tanks were like 75 years old or something. So suddenly you realize 75 years ago, the people knew where that cemetery was. So they put it in, they knew that line, they understood it, so that's why the cemetery was put there. So as to who owns that, I don't know, but I am very convinced that they knew and did the research on that well and found it out when they built the building. Unlike St. Paul's, man, this is political, I'm gonna be careful on that one. The old, is it St. Paul's, the one back on Stanley Street where the trouble was? Les, if I got the right name?
On Jail Street, yes.
Yeah, the one where the problem was with the digging and with the fellow. And anyways, the old Anglican cemetery back there, and it's right in the minutes of Chatham-Kent Council talking about, that cemetery back there and the moving of and finding of old graves and so on. We didn't know anything about that, well, it was really well known.
The one near No Frills. Now remember, municipality will usually tell you Maple Leaf was the first public cemetery. But if you read back in the 1850s council minutes, the council was paying to erect a fence along the Chatham burial grounds, which was along along Indian Creek Road, which would be, obviously, it seems, the one that is behind No Frills. And I understand, I wasn't in the course, but I understand the person that taught the genealogy course for the elder
Hostel?
Whatever you call it, the elder college thing, that he also referred to that site. So apparently through his knowledge, he also
Okay.
wrote it. And that would suggest that the council is putting up a fence along that property. It must have been owned at that time by the town. And it's still a park.
Yep, and of course,
Tissaman Park.
when they say the old Chatham Cemetery, was Chatham Cemetery the name of it? We don't know, that's the best guess we can give. And we pretty well go with the same names as you people do, because it's, and they were names that were given, which would make sense. In some cases, there are about 3 names with some of these old ones, and it can start to become confusing, but. Any other questions? Okay.
Excuse me. Would your website have the names of people who do not have monuments?
No.
Why not? Other than workload.
We get
I'm
the
trying to
names
think
from Tombstone. We get the names from Tombstone.
Yeah, right.
John, can I just, from the Kent Branch's perspective, could I just say something?
I didn't hear, what?
Donna, could say something on behalf of the Kent branch,
Yeah,
probably
okay.
relating to that question?
Okay. First of all, we do have some of the plot burials for Maple Leaf Cemetery. One copy we are allowed, and it is on the computer in the library, and we do have cards on it. Now, John and I have talked often about Newcomb Cemetery, and I'm very familiar with the records on that cemetery. The only records that exist on burials in that particular cemetery are the tombstone transcriptions done by Kent Branch OGS, and a small little black book that lists some of the people that bought plots in there. And I think is an issue for many cemeteries.
And actually, we found that I was allowed to see it. At the time, I wasn't allowed to photograph it. Then we were allowed to photograph it. And then it was lost. The other thing that, there are different things that have happened. For instance, there were records of old Maple Leaf Cemetery, which are known to have been placed in the basement of the old house before it was wrecked, and Chatham-Kent was told of those records, and they simply went in and destroyed the house and didn't take them out. And so these were some of the very old original books of the cemetery. I'm not gonna tell you, this gets into kind of personal names, so I don't think I should tell you how we got that information. But it was very, very, very direct. It was correct. The other thing you can get into, we have ran into a couple of times where people said, you know, I've got the records for such and such a cemetery, but there's no way I'm gonna give them out. Like they belong to me, yeah, right. And Chatham-Kent are not gonna get their hands on this material. So I'm gonna keep it, and when I die, my family has got instructions on burning this material. And that's not an exaggeration, we've ran into that a couple of times. There's still a lot of discontent out there with amalgamation and so on. And that's, you know, it's so hard. Ogletree Cemetery is right where I live. And one of my neighbors, Foster Gillespie, remembers somebody coming 40 years ago and getting a book from his dad. And he says, trouble is I don't know who. Well, I don't blame Foster. I probably wouldn't remember in the same circumstance either. That book is somewhere, we don't know where it's gone, and there is zero documentation on old Ogletree, absolutely nothing.
John? Maybe you would mention about the Otter Creek one, the story about that. Of how it predated the Wallaceburg use.
Yeah, like the history behind it. Yeah, one of the things that you will find on our website is there is a separate area for history of other cemeteries. And there is a lot of them listed where there's history listed. And it's quite a listing, it really is, and it's quite impressive what we found. And the good part of that area is there was never an area before to document all that in one place, so it was never collected. But suddenly it's there, and the website is all set out with an area like with Maple Leaf and so on, and then other cemeteries. And if you look, there's all the history of Maple Leaf and St. Anthony's here and down below. Then on the front page, or on the main index page, there's other cemeteries. And basically, when you get into Otter Creek, it started out, we found out that there was it Neville that was originally called Les? There was another name.
No, that's another one.
Nolan, yeah.
Yeah, Nolan, yes.
Yeah, right, that you folks had, and we found out that Otter Creek was a good name. It's right kind of behind the Wallaceburg Cemetery, or hospital. And how it got started, it was Catholic originally, and there was a Catholic, more like a monastery there, I think, at one point. And a priest used to go around and gather up basically the bodies of the dead in his canoe, and canoed as far up the creek or the river as he could virtually always canoe, and knew that he could always canoe. Got out of the canoe and formed a burial ground there and began to bury people. And that today is Otter Creek. We went in, we found it, we traced it, and now what I found was there actually seemed to be another distinct cemetery in front, which was a little bit hard to figure out, never quite did. Was it a cemetery? I don't know, I still kind of think it was. But definitely this was the story of how Otter Creek began, was that it began as this very highly Catholic area, and then it just kept continuing through and through. And then gradually at one point it was abandoned. Something happened, and I'm not going to tell you the story as to what happened because it's going to tend to make one family look at fault, and I don't think they were. So what I'm going to simply say is a lot of the monuments kind of disappeared, but then some of them were left, and these last few, there's stories about what happened to them, but I'm not sure what. But anyways, it gradually disappeared. Today, it's kind of like a little park in there, but it's not marked. So if you don't know where it is, you wouldn't know. one of the things that I'm working on now is getting GPS for all these cemeteries but Les has that, and we're gradually working on that, and 911 locations and so on. But like everything else, the site is huge. To give you an idea, there are 4 sizes for each photograph on there. There's 3 that you can see plus another one. Each one of those is basically a page plus all of the other documentation as well. So there's approximately, I think I figured one day around 160,000 pages on the website. So it can be a little bit hard to keep track of and keep it navigable for anybody else. I think there was.
I just wanted to say I wish you luck on the cooperation with the new council, because we're gonna get rid of the old one.
Yep.
Would you happen to know the reason for bodies being moved in Maple Leaf Cemetery? I researched my grandfather and found his grave, and they told me that he had been moved from Old St. Anthony's to New St. Anthony's. What would be the reason for something like that?
There's something went on there, and I have to be a little careful with this because again, this is dowsing, okay, but there is so much dowsing evidence that I really believe this is true. If you look on big parts of that bank on the cemetery side, now the triangular side is the old potter's field or the stranger's burial ground, okay, that's that triangular with the new grassed area. But the other side there of the creek bank, on both sides of that creek bank all the way back and around, in different areas there is evidence of a lot of burials in there. We have never checked it with GPR, ground penetrating radar, to see the radar, it is not as what's the shows on, the detective shows on channel 62. They show up now and then, and you know, you go to this, oh yeah, there's a burial site. It ain't quite that accurate, okay? But it's good indication, but I would never want to make fun of it. But there is something going on those banks, and I believe that after a lot of flooding, maybe there were a lot of graves there that were dug up. It might also be that it was an old potter's field. And I originally thought that that's what it was because everything was full. I tend to think that it might actually be both, that it was an old potter's field at one point or a singles area, and probably more likely a singles area, and actually there were internments there that were flooded so often they dug them up and moved them. And I would expect that in your case that was the case. We do know that in some cases that happened. There are a lot of other cases where it happened too. There's a story in the old Dawson Cemetery, which some of you will know if you go out this side of the river road, and if you went out so far and there were a lot of monuments that were knocked over. We actually repaired them about a year back, or 2 years back, I guess now. But new family moved in there one time. They had a great big dog. I think it was a German Shepherd, as I recall. 2 different occasions they had neighbors come in. And the neighbors got there to have supper, and they noticed 2 beef bones lying on the porch or on the landing. Well, those, as they said, those weren't beef bones. The dog had gone exploring on the river bank and found those and carried them up. He wanted to bring him in the house. And this happens with the river. Of course, there are many examples of that.
Another horror story is I worked with a girl quite a few number of years ago. Her father had passed on, and her mother lived on for another 15, 17 years. When her mother finally died, and they were getting ready to have the gravesite dug up by the city, they discovered that someone else had already been buried there. when they went back through, they discovered that the city had made a great deal of mistakes and people were not in the spots where they should be.
Yeah.
And that was all covered up and nobody ever knew.
Yeah.
Did she get an apology from the city? No, she didn't.
Yeah.
But she did get the privilege of having the body that was buried there removed, and her mother did get to be beside her father, her husband.
There are some mistakes too as to why that happened. I'm not sure. Let's just say that it was due to a certain illness on one or two caretakers. But there were only a certain number of caretakers there, and I'm not going to bring it out because that reflects back on the family, and I tend to think these are stories. So I think that what I will say is that originally all of the maps were up here because basically most of these old caretakers and all these old cemeteries, I've heard different stories about this, they wanted to keep their job. If they got fired, then the cemetery lost everything because the map was all here in that brain, okay? So then what happened, they kept the map up there as long as they could, but all of a sudden they die, and what happens? And that is all lost. And so that could become a real problem, and it did in a lot of cases. They just didn't have the proper maps in different cemeteries. And I think out here that probably was the case for a while. It was around 1913 time period that the first map was made. We just uncovered that recently in Maple Leaf. I don't know if St. Anthony's was done at the same time, but we have uncovered that St. Anthony's and Maple Leaf right from the start were sort of somewhat co-administered. They're certainly very separate cemeteries, but everybody thinks, and I always thought that they were totally separate right from the start, but for not too long in, and I'm not sure at the very start, but certainly in 1913, there was a certain amount of co-administration there between the two of them. So,
Well, I think we might have to cut you off.
okay. No problem.
Thank you very much. That was very
Okay.
interesting.
Oh,
And,
you're welcome. Okay.
You said that you felt that you get too much credit, but I think you're very passionate and driven, and the website is a reflection of that. So we appreciate you sharing. Definitely go back and check the website out. As we had been chatting, and he was saying there's so much more on the website that he didn't even touch on tonight. So it's a good resource if you're looking for anybody in Chatham-Kent. Just to go back for a few minutes to the dowsing. I don't know if anybody here knows Steve Fulton from the Niagara branch. He is our computer tech guy for OGS. He is a computer geek. He is techie. You'll see when he's got 2-3 phones stuck on the side of him. I just want to show you this little video that he did, if someone can get the links. Again, just your average guy, chair of the Niagara branch.
Hey guys, just want to talk a little bit about cemetery dowsing. I know there's some skeptics out there, and I can't really explain it, being a computer guy and all. But what I've done here is I've just taken some clothes hangers. So how they are, nothing fancy, just cut it off and bent them straight. So I got 2 of them, and we're going to show you how this works. So I'm just going to stand here, and they're pointing out. The wind's a little breezy, but it's okay. They're loose in my hands, and I'm just going to start walking forward. I passed the first headstone, and they turned in. I didn't do that. And then they go back out as I cross over. Again, I walk over another one. These are just loose in my hand. Another one. And another one. And finally the last one. And as I step off, it's in. I'm heading to another headstone. We're out, and they start to cross again. So, as I was saying, I can't really explain it. All they are is just clothes hangers loosely in my hand so I can't physically turn it. I thought I would share that with you. Have a good day.